The Zirak Dominion had ruled this part of the galaxy for over 1,000,000 years. Their empire stretched across thousands of star systems. They were powerful, proud, and feared by all. But they had one law that was never broken. Humans must never return. 800,000 years ago, the Zirak had found humanity. Back then, humans were weak. They had no powerful ships, no advanced weapons. The Zirak saw them as a problem. Humans were different. They did not obey. They did not submit. They always fought back. So, the Zirak did what they always did to troublemakers. They erased them. They destroyed every human colony. They burned Earth. They hunted down every survivor. And then, when they were sure no human was left, they erased all records. Humanity became nothing more than a forgotten whisper. Now, after so many years, the Zirak had new problems: rebellions, rival empires, and the slow decay of their own rule. They had long forgotten about humanity. But today, something changed. The warning. Admiral Jorak stood in the command center of the Zirak homeworld. The air was thick with tension. His eyes were locked onto the large holographic display in front of him. Unidentified ships had entered their space. At first, it was just a few, then a dozen, then hundreds. Now, there were thousands. Massive ships, dark, silent, moving with impossible speed. "Are they one of ours?" Jorak asked. His voice was calm, but inside, he felt something strange. Fear. "Negative, Admiral. Their design. It matches nothing in our database," the officer replied. "Try to communicate." The officer sent a signal. Silence. No response. Jorak clenched his claws. "Send a scout fleet. I'd want answers." The vanishing. 5 Zirak scout ships launched at full speed. Each one was armed, fast, and built for deep space combat. They approached the unknown fleet, weapons ready. Then, one by one, they vanished. No explosions, no distress calls, just gone. The command center went silent. Jorak stared at the screen. The scout fleet had disappeared in less than a minute. Then, a single transmission came through. It was audio only. A deep, distorted voice. "We have returned." Jorak's blood ran cold. "Identify yourself," he barked. Silence. Then the voice spoke again. "Humanity remembers." The transmission ended, and in that moment, Admiral Jorak understood something terrible. The enemy they thought they had destroyed was back. And this time, they were stronger. Admiral Jorak stood frozen, his mind racing. Humanity. The word felt like an echo from a forgotten past, something spoken only in ancient records buried deep in the Zirak archives. It was impossible. Humans were gone, erased. Yet, the transmission had been clear. They had returned. Outside, in the darkness of space, the unknown fleet continued its silent advance. No aggression, no response to communication. Just movement, calculated, unstoppable. Jorak's claws tightened against the metal console. He needed answers. He needed to understand what he was facing. With a sharp gesture, he ordered another fleet into position. This time, not scouts, warships. 50 of the Zirak's finest, each one capable of glassing a planet. They moved in formation, surrounding the largest of the approaching vessels. Warnings were sent. No response. The order was given: fire. Beams of energy, missiles, plasma cannons, all unleashed in a coordinated strike. The Zirak ships fired with the full force of their empire, enough firepower to annihilate entire star systems. The space between them and the unknown fleet burned with energy. But then, as the light faded, Jorak's blood ran cold. The massive ships were still there, untouched. No damage, no sign they had even registered the attack. And then they reacted. The largest ship, an obsidian giant covered in strange, shifting patterns, turned slightly, not fleeing, not retreating, just acknowledging. And then something impossible happened. The Zerek warships began disappearing. One by one, they flickered and vanished. No explosions, no wreckage. Just gone, as if erased from existence. Jorek's crew panicked. Shouts filled the command center. Sensors picked up nothing. No weapons, no energy signatures, just silence. Then, another transmission came through, the same deep voice as before. Your weapons mean nothing. Your empire is dust. And now, you will understand what it means to be forgotten. The message ended, and suddenly, alarms blared across the Zerek homeworld. The fleet was no longer in orbit. Jorek's breath caught in his throat. The enemy had not just destroyed their forces, they had bypassed them completely. The unknown ships were now above the capital planet, and for the first time in a million years, the Zerek Dominion felt true terror. Humanity had returned, and they were here for revenge. Panic spread through the Zerek homeworld like wildfire. Cities filled with towering spires and grand palaces were now bathed in the eerie shadow of the massive ships above. The skies, once clear and controlled, were now dominated by something beyond comprehension. The Zerek, a race that had ruled for nearly a million years, had always believed themselves untouchable. But now, as their people looked up, they saw something they could not explain. Ships unlike any in their records, vast, silent, watching. Admiral Jorek's claws trembled against the command console as reports flooded in. Their planetary defenses were failing. Not because they had been destroyed. No, it was worse than that. They were simply shutting down. Shields powered down. Cannons refused to fire. Systems that had worked flawlessly for thousands of years were now dead. It was as if some unseen force had decided they no longer functioned. Jorek barked orders, demanding a full system reboot, but deep down, he knew it was useless. The enemy was not using brute force. They were in control. Another transmission came through. This time, not from their own communications array, but directly into their minds. Every Zerek, from the highest officials to the lowest workers, heard it. 800,000 years ago, you erased us. You burned our worlds. You buried our name. And now you tremble in your own cities, feeling the weight of what you have done. Jorek staggered back, his mind overwhelmed. This was not normal communication. This was something else, something unnatural. Zerek were telepathic, but they had never experienced anything like this, a voice that carried not just words, but memories. Flashes of burning worlds, screaming children, Zerek soldiers laughing as they wiped out entire human settlements. The past was being forced into their minds. And worst of all, they were not just seeing it, they were feeling it. Every Zerek on the planet, from the oldest generals to the youngest hatchlings, suddenly understood the pain they had caused, the terror, the suffering, the genocide. And they felt it as if it were happening to them. Screams filled the streets. Warriors collapsed, shaking, clutching their heads. Some clawed at their own eyes, desperate to make the vision stop. The Zerek had always been proud, always confident that their power made them superior. But now, their minds were breaking. They had once thought humans were weak because they refused to obey. Now, they realized their mistake. Humanity had not been destroyed. Humanity had evolved. Jorek gritted his teeth, forcing himself to think. He needed to act, needed to do something. But then the sky changed. The massive ships began to glow, a deep crimson light pulsing from their hulls. And in that moment, Jorek understood the truth. This was not just a war. This was a reckoning. Jorek had never felt fear like this before. The Zerek had always been the masters of the galaxy, the rulers of countless worlds, the architects of entire civilizations. They had crushed rebellions, wiped out species, rewritten history to shape the universe in their image. And yet, in this moment, standing in the heart of his command center, he felt like nothing. Like prey. The massive ships above the capital world continued to pulse with that deep crimson glow. It was not an attack, not yet, but it was a warning. A reminder that humanity was in control now. Reports came in from across the planet. Chaos, panic, complete system failure. Communications were still up, but every attempt to call for help was met with silence. The Zirac Dominion had fleets spread across the galaxy, armies stationed on hundreds of worlds, yet none of them responded. It was as if they no longer existed. Jorak refused to believe it. He ordered a scan of nearby systems, desperate for any sign of their forces. The results came in within seconds, and what he saw nearly made his heart stop. Their fleets were gone. Entire armadas, thousands of ships strong, had simply vanished. No wreckage, no distress signals. One moment they had been there, patrolling the Empire as they always had. And the next, they were nothing. Erased, just like humanity had been so long ago. The realization sent a chill through his body. This was not a war in the way the Zirac understood it. There were no battles, no prolonged sieges, no drawn-out struggles for territory. This was extermination. And the Zirac were the ones being hunted. A deep vibration shook the command center as the largest of the human ships began to move. It descended slowly, deliberately, until it was close enough to the capital city that its sheer size cast an enormous shadow over the land. The streets below were filled with millions of Zirac, once proud citizens who now trembled in terror, unsure of whether to run or bow. They had spent generations believing humans were weak, primitive, unworthy of existence. Now, as they looked up, they saw the truth. Humanity was beyond them. The Zirac had advanced technology, but this was something else entirely. This was power that defied understanding. Then the voice returned, not through speakers, not through any transmission, but inside their very minds. For 800,000 years, you believed yourselves untouchable. You spread across the stars, taking what you wished, destroying what you pleased. But now you faced the consequence of your actions. Jorak gritted his teeth, trying to fight against the voice, but it was everywhere, pressing against his thoughts, suffocating him. It was not just a sound, it was a presence. When you burned our worlds, when you slaughtered our people, did you ever stop to wonder what you were creating? Did you ever consider what we might become? Images filled Jorek's mind, forced upon him with such clarity that he could not look away. He saw humans in their final moments, screaming as Zirac warships bombarded their cities. He saw the desperate survivors, fleeing across the stars, hunted, broken, forgotten. He saw them on the edge of extinction, and then he saw what came after. The evolution, the rebirth, the transformation into something greater, something unstoppable. Humanity had not merely survived. They had ascended. They had become something beyond flesh and blood, beyond technology. They had become a force that could not be reasoned with, a force that had spent hundreds of thousands of years in the shadows, growing, learning, waiting for this moment. And now, that moment had come. Jorak fell to his knees, panting, his mind overwhelmed by the weight of it all. He had fought many enemies, commanded wars across the galaxy, but he had never faced anything like this. How could he fight something that was no longer bound by the same rules of existence? How could he resist something that had already decided his fate? Then the voice spoke one last time, and this time there was no anger, no hatred, only finality. Your time is over. The crimson glow of the human ships intensified. The Zirac, once rulers of the galaxy, could do nothing but watch as the judgment they had once delivered to others finally came for them. Jorak gasped for air, his body trembling as the weight of the human presence pressed down on him. It was like standing before a god, an ancient force beyond his understanding. Around him, his officers lay on the ground, their minds shattered by the overwhelming power of the transmission. Some of them whimpered, others clutched their heads as if trying to tear the voice from their skulls. The Zirac were breaking. a species that had ruled for 1 million years, that had enslaved entire civilizations, that had erased humanity from history. Now, they were the ones begging for mercy. But mercy did not come. Outside, the city had fallen into chaos. The once proud Zurich citizens, beings who had lived in absolute certainty of their superiority, were now running through the streets in blind terror. Some tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Others knelt in the open, heads bowed, praying to gods they had never believed in. The great towers of the Zurich capital, monuments to their conquests, their strength, their power, shook as the sky above darkened. The massive human ships, their crimson glow pulsing like a heartbeat, loomed over everything. The Zurich had destroyed Earth, had wiped out every trace of human civilization, had laughed as they reduced entire colonies to dust. But humanity had not died. Humanity had changed. And now, the Zurich were about to learn what that meant. Jorak forced himself to his feet, gripping the console for support. His claws dug into the metal as he stared at the display screen in front of him. The Zurich homeworld was cut off. No transmissions were getting through. Every ship in orbit was gone. Their planetary defenses were still offline, as if they had never existed at all. But the worst part, the part that truly made his blood freeze, was the time. From the moment the human fleet had arrived to now, only 27 minutes had passed. In less than half an hour, an empire that had lasted for 1 million years had been reduced to nothing. This was not war. This was extermination. A new wave of terror swept through him as another realization struck. The Zurich dominion spanned thousands of star systems. If the humans were here, it meant they had already dealt with every other Zurich world. It meant that, one by one, every colony, every military outpost, every fleet had already been erased. There was nothing left. They had believed themselves invincible. They had believed their rule would never end. They had been wrong. Then, for the first time since the human fleet arrived, something changed. The largest of the ships, the obsidian giant that hovered directly over the Zurich capital, opened. A rift, a doorway of swirling black energy, split down the center of the ship's hull. It was not like any technology the Zurich had ever seen. It was not natural. It was alive. And then they came. Figures emerged from the darkness. Tall, humanoid, but wrong. Their movements were too smooth, their steps too precise. Their bodies, once flesh and blood, now something else. They had no need for armor, no need for weapons. They were the weapons. Their eyes burned with the same crimson glow as their ships. They did not rush forward like invading soldiers. They walked, slowly, calmly, with absolute certainty. The Zurich had seen fear before. They had watched as species fell before them, had heard the screams of dying civilizations, but they had never seen anything like this. This was not fear. This was inevitability. Jorek's breathing was shallow as he stared at the screen, watching the humans descend upon the capital city. He knew what would happen next. He could see it before it even began. The Zurich would try to resist. They would scream. They would beg. But it would not matter. The humans were not here to negotiate. They were here to finish what had started 800,000 years ago. A final transmission echoed through every mind on the planet. The same deep voice, calm and unshaken. But this time, it did not speak in anger. It did not speak in hate. It spoke in truth. You thought you erased us. You thought time would hide your crimes. But we were always here, in the void, watching, waiting. And now, Zurich, now you understand. The voice faded, but the meaning remained. This was justice. This was balance. This was the end. And as the first Zurich fell, consumed by the silent, unstoppable force of the returned humanity, Admiral Jorak closed his eyes. He had spent his life believing his species was untouchable. He had spent his life laughing at the ruins of lesser civilizations, at the cries of the weak. Now, in his final moments, He finally understood what it meant to be forgotten. Jorak's body felt weightless as he slumped against the command console, his vision blurring. The screens before him showed a nightmare, his nightmare. The Zyrek capital, once a beacon of their power, was now a graveyard in the making. The humans had arrived, and with them, the end of everything he had ever known. The streets below were no longer filled with proud citizens. Instead, the Zirac, the rulers of the galaxy, the mighty conquerors of 1,000,000 years, were running. Their once great warriors stumbled through the city, weapons useless in their claws. They fired at the approaching humans, but the bullets, the plasma rounds, the energy beams did nothing. The humans didn't even slow down. The Zirac had fought countless wars, crushed entire species into dust, yet for the first time in their existence, they faced an enemy they could not hurt. Jorak clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. There had to be something they could do. Some weapon, some strategy. But every scenario ended the same way. Humanity had not come for negotiations. They had not come for prisoners. They had come to erase the Zirac, just as the Zirac had once erased them. Another transmission echoed through his mind, cutting through the chaos like a blade. It was the same voice, deep and calm, carrying the weight of eternity. You built your empire on the ashes of others. You spread across the stars, taking, destroying, believing yourselves eternal. But no empire lasts forever. No ruler escapes judgment. And your judgment has come. Jorak turned to his remaining officers, but they were broken. Some were catatonic, still trapped in the memories the humans had forced upon them. Visions of the Zirac's own cruelty relived from the eyes of their victims. Others had abandoned their posts, running to the exits in a blind panic. These were his finest soldiers, his most brilliant tacticians, and yet they were falling apart before his eyes. The Zirac had always been the hunters, but today they were the prey. A sudden, high-pitched screech filled the air, the sound of reality itself breaking apart. Jorak snapped his head toward the screen and saw something he could not comprehend. The city itself was disappearing. Not burning, not crumbling. Disappearing. Buildings flickered, then faded like mist under the morning sun. Zirac warriors turned to run, only for their bodies to blur, distort, and then simply cease to exist. No screams, no resistance, just nothing. The humans had become something beyond war, beyond destruction. They were not conquering the Zirac. They were unmaking them. Jorak's breathing turned ragged. He slammed his fist against the console, his claws tearing into the metal. He would not let this happen. If the Zirac were to fall, they would fall fighting. He reached for the planetary override system. One last desperate act. If they could not win, he would unleash their final weapon, the total planetary detonation. If they were to die, then so be it. But they would take the humans with them. His fingers hovered over the activation sequence, but before he could press it, everything froze. Time itself seemed to shatter. The sounds of alarms, the crackling energy of the control panels, the terrified screams from outside, all of it stopped. Jorak felt his own breath catch in his throat as a terrible silence fell over the room. And then, they appeared. A shadow moved behind him. Not a ship, not a transmission. A figure, tall, humanoid, and yet wrong. It stood in the center of the command room, where there had been nothing before. Its body shifted, as if reality itself could not fully contain it. Its eyes, deep, endless, burning red, locked onto him. Jorak tried to move. He couldn't. The figure took a step closer, slow and deliberate. And then, for the first time, the voice spoke not through a transmission, not through his mind, but directly in front of him. You believed yourself a god. The voice was impossibly deep, ancient, inhuman. It carried the weight of countless generations, of a civilization that had once been weak, but had returned as something far beyond strength. You are not. Jorak wanted to respond, to speak, to beg. But before he could open his mouth, The figure raised its hand. And in that moment, Jorek understood. There would be no surrender, no final battle, no desperate escape. The Zirak dominion was over. And as the crimson glow consumed him, Admiral Jorek, once the most feared commander in the galaxy, was erased, just as his species had erased humanity so long ago. The Zirak dominion ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no battle, no last stand. One moment, the mighty empire stood, stretching across the stars, a civilization that had reigned for nearly 1,000,000 years. The next, it was gone, as if it had never been. The Zirak homeworld, once a sprawling metropolis of towering spires and endless cities, was nothing more than an empty void, where billions of Zirak had lived, where armies had trained, where rulers had plotted their endless conquests. There was now nothing. No ruins, no remains, just silence. Across the galaxy, on worlds that had once suffered under Zirak rule, alien civilizations lifted their heads in confusion. For as long as they had known, the Zirak had been untouchable, their power absolute. But now, without warning, they were simply gone. The great warships that had once darkened the skies were no more. The palaces of Zirak warlords had vanished. The planets they had colonized were silent. At first, there was uncertainty. Whispers spread through the stars. The Zirak could not have fallen, not so quickly, not so completely. But then, as the truth became clear, a new understanding took hold. The impossible had happened. The oppressors, the conquerors, the destroyers of worlds had met their end, and the ones responsible had left without a trace. The humans were nowhere to be seen. Their great ships, their silent warriors, their crimson glow, all had vanished, just as the Zirak had. They had come for justice, and now their work was done. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, the galaxy was free. No overlords, no masters, no Zirak. But with that freedom came a new fear, a warning carved into history itself. Humanity had returned from the void. They had risen from their own extinction, and they had become something greater than flesh, greater than technology, a force beyond comprehension. For those who remained, only one truth remained certain. Never again would any species dare to erase another. Because now, they all knew, some things do not stay buried, some enemies do not die, and if you try to erase humanity, they will come back, and they will make you pay.